This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. David Schemm, State Executive Director of the Kansas Farm Service Agency, begins today's show as he highlights FSA farm programs and explains what he is doing traveling around the state. K-State weed specialist Sarah Ganske and K-State weed scientist Pat Geier keep the show rolling as they discuss the use of ammonium sulfate and importance of residual herbicides for corn. Part of a Cattle Chat podcast from the Beef Cattle Institute ends the show as Brad White, Phillip Lancaster, and Maddie Mancke chat about research on feeding times to help keep feedlot cattle cooler. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Wednesday show with an update from State Executive Director of the Kansas Farm Service Agency, David Schemm. David, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Shelby.
David, wanting to take a look at farm programs this week, and what are a few programs that are currently having some news or getting things taken care of?
No, absolutely. So one of them, I think, is on a lot of producers' mind, and I know a lot of producers have been in to sign up for the Farmer Bridge Assistance Program here. You know, that's something that we opened up here late March here. Then again, short deadline on that program there. Deadline to apply for that program is April 17th there. Kind of a neat program there. Again, for those producers who haven't already signed up. And if you're interested, but that is a program that you can sign up through Farmers.gov for those producers who have gotten that logged in and registered on that. If they have questions on that, please feel free to click on the link. There's a lot of helpful resources, or go into our county offices. But once they get into Farmers.gov, get their Farmers.gov authorization, login.gov authorization, 2 clicks, and they can be signed up for the Farmer Bridge Assistance Program there. But no, offices have been taking a lot of applications, cranking out. Just looked at some numbers here earlier today there. You know, this program, roughly around that $12 billion was allocated to be spent on that program for the nation. Thus far, Kansas has sent out over $630 million there. And far as actual producers, that's obviously a lot of producers there. Over 30,000 producers have applied there. So, it looks like from the numbers that we show on our file for producers that have yet to come in, we've still got just a little over 30% of our producers that have still to sign up. I know a lot of offices are in that process right now of working through those lists and making sure they're getting a hold of or contacting those producers who may not be aware of the program. But absolutely, if you haven't signed up for that program, Shelby, they need to make sure that they reach out to the local office or go to farmers.gov there. Still a few weeks left here to be able to sign up for that and get signed up for that. You mentioned other programs. Yeah, we've got supplemental disaster relief program there. We're continuing to implement the stage 2 shallow loss, quality loss component of that program there. That deadline is the end of April here, April 30th, to sign up for that program there. So if producers have any questions on that, definitely make sure that they reach out to the local county office. And then a little bit more on our conservation side of things, Shelby, we do have CRP that has opened up, and right now we do have continuous CRP that is open to sign up, as well as general CRP that's open for sign up there. I know some of our producers out there also have grassland that they're interested in signing up for the CRP for grassland there. No announcement date yet on when that sign up will start there. We know they are planning on having a sign up this year, but no news on that one there. But if they have or are interested in continuous or general, again, come into the county office on that.
You mentioned the login.gov, the online website portal for producers. Is that going well? Have there been many hiccups from what your employees are hearing in county offices?
It's been going amazingly well. Now, I will say that I think all of us are familiar with our laptops and phones, and I think we can all quite clearly say that we do maybe have hiccups occasionally. That happens on any of those there, whether it's not sometimes they're self-inflicted hiccups, or if there's issues there with the actual software or whatever it be. But overall, Shelby, it has been amazingly well that has gone down. It's just been really neat. Some of the feedback that I've received from producers there, like I mentioned earlier, some producers have power of attorney or signature authority for possibly other trusts or entities or landlords, whatever it may be. Those are some of the caveats that if they have difficulty working through, go in, talk to that county office. County office can definitely help them work through on that. But once they do, Shelby, get that Farmers.gov, login.gov taken care of, that's kind of that one-time thing there that gives them access into the system. Once they have that, they can go into the Farmer Bridge Assistance. And when I say literally it's 2 clicks, it is 2 clicks for them to sign up a program. The neat caveat the other day, I had a producer reach out to me and they were just like, I've got to tell you, it was so cool. I signed up 2 clicks with my FBA. Then I went up to my crop insurance agents and I was talking to them about some of the crop insurance program. The agents told me that, well, we need your acreage report, your 578. The producer said, well, hey, let me check that. He went to farmers.gov. He pulled up his 578 right there and was able to send that right over to his crop insurance agents, saved him the trip back over to the FSA office. He just said that was the coolest thing ever. So a lot of neat tools associated that, and I know definitely more stuff to be coming down the pipeline on being able to enhance that tool for producers to utilize out there. So really neat thing there. Definitely encourage producers that if they haven't taken the time, try to sign up for it. If they run into caveats, don't hesitate to reach out to that county office.
David, what is it like taking a program, even if we've done it for multiple years, from national office and getting it to the producer?
That just takes a lot of work. A lot of times if it's a software program, it's the ability, Shelby. And so I'm with our producers and our people audience out there that say, why can't FSA talk with RMA, talk with NRCS? And I understand that a lot of times we just deal with different software or honestly sometimes different language, various things like that we're working with in order to get that software to work across. And I know the secretary's talked about a lot and has announced that this one farmer and one file, and this is what's going on behind the scenes and the amount of work that it's taking to make sure that all of our systems, whether it's FSA, NRCS, RMA, whoever it is truly talking with each other. And honestly, it's making sure that we're doing the job and being efficient like we know we need to be there to make sure we're better serving our producers there and being able to give that greater convenience up to it. So it takes a lot of time. It is a lot of, Shelby, getting down into that nitty gritty. It's a lot of programming and people back there spending time understanding the components of the various agencies' software, how interpretation is of various components of that, and writing that software language to deliver that program out to the county offices to be able to implement for the producers there. So not a small undertaking, but it's something that needed to happen a long time ago, and it's something that Secretary Rollins, stepping into her role, she was very much focused upon, and I know that goes clear down the leadership, clear to the administrator and chief of NRCS to make sure that we're utilizing these tools, Shelby.
And David, as you're sitting and we're chatting right now, you're not in your usual office. And so what's happening this week for you?
One of a goal of mine and opportunities I've had in my career is very much, I believe in the old saying of my boots in your dirt or my boots in your mud, is that I believe in getting out there and gaining a perspective of the people that are key to being able to deliver it. And it's truly out there in our county offices. Our producers know that. They know their local county office and those people in that local county office that deliver those programs to those producers there. And that's where I am very focused upon making sure that I get out there and visit county offices. And so I did it underneath my first tenure, Shelby, and I am doing it now underneath my second tenure as I'm starting the process of visiting all 96 county offices across the state, because I truly want to hear from our employees there and our county committee members there, each of one of those offices there. I've been started to sit down with them here this week as I go around South Central Kansas and listening to our employees there and our county committee members to understand what the challenges they're facing, what they're hearing from their producers, things that I can do, the state office can do, national can do to help that county office do a better job of delivering those programs to those offices. So I get to enjoy truly some God's country across the state, but in particular, it's God's country here in Pratt, Kansas, here today, and enjoying South Central Kansas. And truly, I'm a farmer and rancher at heart, and it's just awesome to be able to see this gorgeous farm country and rangeland out here, and the cattle out there, and the greenweed. It's a lot of fun and very enjoyable.
So, as you're sitting in the car driving around Kansas, how are things looking out the window?
Well, right now, thus far, and definitely reinforced by what I've heard from our county committee members and producers that have engaged with there, is that wheat looks awful green and lush out there. I know we got pretty cold here. Wheat's looking really good right now, but it's getting pretty awful dry. And, we're probably kind of needing some rain here. And of course, I know for our ranchers out there and our livestock guys here, we're starting to get that warmer season and getting some rain in here and helping to spur on that early season, cool season grass and start getting these pastures green up is pretty critical. But things are looking pretty decent for the most part, Shelby, but I know we're getting dry, and we know how this state can surely be out there, that we can go from wet to dry back to wet really fast here. So definitely praying for that rain to come in here and make sure we kind of tame some of these winds. We don't need any more winds. We've already had our fair share of winds already this year.
If people want to find out more information from the Farm Service Agency, how can they do that?
As always, Shelby, go to Farmers.gov. That is a plethora of information.
David, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you, Shelby.
That was State Executive Director of the Kansas Farm Service Agency, David Schemm. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show discussing a couple of recent e-update articles. And then to talk about their articles, we're joined by K-State weed specialist Sarah Ganske and K-State weed scientist Pat Geier. Sarah, Pat, I appreciate you both taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having us, Shelby.
The first article for us to talk about today, titled Ammonium Sulfate is Not Just for Conditioning Spray Water. And before we dive into this, Pat, what is ammonium sulfate?
So AMS, or ammonium sulfate, is a common adjuvant that we add in with particularly our herbicide applications for corn. We typically think of using ammonium sulfate or AMS when we're putting on glyphosate. What it does is the ammonium sulfate actually conditions our hard water that we have in this part of the state, and it keeps the cations or the positive ions in our hard water from interacting with our weak acid herbicides like glyphosate. It does help to bind with the herbicide molecules themselves and actually help them move into the plant through the waxy cuticle of the plant, and makes the herbicides work a little bit better.
You mentioned this part of the state. So is this something you see growers across Kansas using, or specific areas?
No, we generally recommend anyone who's spraying with glyphosate in Kansas to use AMS with it to condition their water. But as I said, there are a number of other herbicides that fit into that weak acid category. We really have to look on the label, see what the label recommends.
One place where we're talking about AMS a lot right now, especially through kind of the central part of the state, is with glufosinate or Liberty applications, right? Pat mentioned all the adjuvant properties of AMS, and that makes it a really important component of a tank mix that contains glufosinate or Liberty.
And what research have you done when it comes to using AMS, specifically in Garden City?
Last year, I looked at a study. Sarah mentioned glufosinate. I had a study looking at adding different rates of AMS with glufosinate and see how that affected control specifically of kochia and Palmer amaranth. And so when I went from 3/4 of a pound of AMS, a pound and a half of AMS, and 3 pounds of AMS, by far the best control I got with both kochia and Palmer amaranth was when I used that 3 pounds per acre of AMS. When I used just the glufosinate by itself, I was getting approximately 60 to 65% control, but that control was greater than 80% when I was using the high rate of AMS with the glufosinate.
A lot of the commercial folks in Kansas, central and western Kansas, are using 5 pounds of AMS with their glufosinate applications. So as we think about, what a trial like this might look like in 2020, the summer of 2026, we'll have a little higher rates of AMS in there probably.
Are there replacement AMSs, and are they being effective or being used?
Yes, there are some AMS replacements. There's really two types. There are what are called the liquid AMS, and then there's what's called AMS replacements. Typically, we have a lot better luck with the liquid AMS. They tend to be more of an AMS product, whereas with the AMS replacements, they may not necessarily have as much AMS in them, so they may not be as effective as just either our liquid AMS or our dry AMS formulations. So we really can't beat just dry AMS.
And we've talked about using AMS, but however, are there times that we should not be using AMS?
Yeah, there are. There are certain herbicides, especially like recently we just had approved labels for over-the-top dicamba on dicamba-resistant soybean and cotton. So those labels, they do specifically prohibit the use of AMS with those products because it can increase the potential for those products to move off target. So we don't want to be using AMS with those dicamba formulations for our over-the-top soybean and cotton applications.
And another e-update article titled Residual Herbicides for Corn waiting to discuss today. And Sarah, why do we care so much about residual herbicides when post-emergence herbicides exist also?
So as we think about, functioning in the world of weeds, particularly pigweeds that are resistant to many of our post-emergence chemistries, residual herbicides applied at planting or early in the growing season really represent our best chance for successful season-long weed control in corn and most of our row crops.
What combination should growers be thinking about using?
So one of the things that I've been talking about some this winter is that when we think about the rule of thumb of mixing herbicide modes of action, we talk about it a lot in terms of herbicide resistance management, but also it does just provide better weed control. We know that 2 effective herbicide modes of action gives us greater weed control than a single herbicide mode of action. So if someone is thinking about going with maybe an acetochlor-based herbicide program at planting, acetochlor plus atrazine is okay, but adding a 3rd mode of action is even better. So acetochlor plus atrazine plus mesotrione is even better.
And what are some options of herbicides people have to use?
Okay, so I just mentioned 3, right? I talked about acetochlor, which is a group 15 herbicide. We call these very long chain fatty acid inhibitors. This includes things like S-metolachlor or dual types of products, dimethenamide, so that would be Outlook, or Verdict, it's a component of Verdict as well, and then pyroxasulfone, which would be your Residua and your Anthem products. Those would be the group 15 herbicides that we think about the most in our cropping systems. So you can pick any one of those for a pre-plant application in corn, or for an early post-emergence application in corn as well, to get that kind of overlapping residual herbicide or that layered residual herbicide. The next herbicide I mentioned in my example earlier was atrazine. So atrazine is an example of a group 5 herbicide. These are photosystem 2 inhibitors. We've used a lot of atrazine for a long time in our corn programs. We know atrazine does have some resistance issues. And we also know that atrazine can be susceptible to enhanced degradation because the soil bacteria are so used to having it around, they break it down pretty quickly. So other group 5 herbicides to think about would be metribuzin. So metribuzin can be applied up to 30 days ahead of corn planting at rates of up to about 5 ounces. Another active ingredient that we saw in the Entrava DX product this year is called amicarbazone. And amicarbazone for corn is only labeled in that Entrava product. And so that can be applied up to 30 days before planting. And it's the Entrava product is a pre-mixture of amicarbazone and metribuzin. So a lot of the application restrictions there actually line up with the application restrictions for metribuzin. Then the third group that I mentioned were HPPD inhibitors or group 27 herbicides. So the example I used before is Callisto or mesotrione. The other product that we use a lot of out of this category is isoxafludil or Balance Flex products. These are the bleachers, so they provide excellent control of pigweeds as well as kochia and some other weeds. Other groups we need to think about here are the PPO inhibitors, with one exception that I'll mention here in just a minute. These are pre-plant products because things like Sharpen or Valor will control your corn. Now, the one exception to this is a herbicide that was introduced to the market last year called Certain. And Certain is a premix of pyroxasulfone, so Zidua, with an encapsulated saflufenicil. So this product does provide good control of kochia and pigweeds. Like most of our products, it looks better when you tank mix it with a little bit of atrazine and probably some mesotrione as well. But it can be applied post-emergence to corn and does provide residual activity more so than contact activity out of that saflufenicil or out of that Sharpen. And then the last group to think about are the group 2 herbicides. We honestly don't talk about group 2 herbicides very much anymore because of the resistance concerns that we have. But products like Python or flumetzilam, which is a component of things like Sure Start and Triple Flex, can help if you have sensitive populations of things like sunflowers, cockleburs, and velvet leaf.
Any final thoughts for growers?
How important that foundation is. If we're going to spend money there. The thing I always tell people at my talks is an ounce of prevention is way better than a pound of cure. I use that probably so much people get sick of hearing me say that, but it's very true. The pre-emergence are extremely important in our corn.
That was K-State weed scientist Pat Geier, and he was joined by K-State weed specialist Sarah Ganske. I will link the e-update articles in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Wednesday show with part of a Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast. And today we're joined by Brad White, Phillip Lancaster, and special guest Maddie Mancke.
One of the concerns, especially in a feeding environment, is it's hard to manage heat stress in the summer when we have fed cattle. And there are different tools that we try to use, but it may involve watering the cattle, shades, other activities. You've spent the last couple summers kind of working broadly in that area. I want to talk about your project for this summer, which was focused on feeding patterns. And tell me kind of what led to this idea and what you tested.
Yeah, so in the summer of 2024, I did a shade trial in the Pacific Northwest at a commercial feed yard looking at the impact of shade on steer performance. And found really good results with that benefiting the cattle performance under shade. But shade is very limited on how we can use it, and there's a huge economic investment in getting shade. So a question formed on what can we do with the cattle that they don't have access to shade? So how can we help mitigate heat stress on the yard level without having that initial investment of having all the animals under shade? So we were talking about how when heat stress occurs, it's the total heat load on the animal. So that includes environmental and metabolic heat. And when that surpasses the animal's ability to dissipate that heat, that's when we see heat stress. So a question formed on, well, why are we feeding cattle in the morning to where their highest metabolic heat load is in the afternoon, which coincides with the peak environmental heat? So we asked, why don't we try feeding cattle at night to offset the heat load during the day?
And Phillip, that's one of the things when we talk about that metabolic heat load, we're talking about the digestion of the feed, and it's actually heating up the cattle. How much of a lag is there between the time that they eat and the time that they would produce the most heat?
It depends a little bit, but generally we think about 4 to 6 hours. With feedlot cattle, they're eating several meals during the day, but if we're feeding in the morning, we're generally starting to feed, real early in the morning, 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning. Then we feed them a little bit mid-morning or later morning, depending on if we're feeding twice a day or 3 times a day. So if they're eating the bulk of their feed before it gets hot in those early morning hours, because that's when their appetite is going to be highest, then, that peak heat of fermentation is going to happen there early to mid-afternoon, right, when we've got peak thermal stress. And so it makes sense that maybe if we feed them in the evening, then that peak heat of fermentation will happen in those early morning hours when the environmental stress is at the lowest for the day, and they'll be able to dissipate that heat better at that time of day.
One of the concerns was the nighttime hours are when cattle typically cool. And so is that a problem? Because now they're heating up metabolically through, and that's one of the things you wanted to investigate is, does this help or not help? So tell us, how did you design this trial? What was the plan to test this hypothesis?
So this was a randomized controlled trial. We allocated steers at terminal sort, which is about 60 days from their projected ship date. So while the animal was in the chute, it got sorted into its respective terminal sort pen based on weight and hip measurements. And then I randomly allocated that animal to AM fed or PM fed. So that consisted of 24 AM fed pens and 24 PM fed pens, totaling just under 8,000 steers total in the study.
After you allocated them, all of them had been fed in the morning. How did you transition those cattle to go from being fed in the morning to the evening?
So we decided to, on the day of terminal sort, we fed all the pens normally. So they all got fed normally in the morning. So when the steers went back after their terminal sort event, they had feed in the bunk. For the remainder of the study, the AM pens got fed normally conventionally with the rest of the yards, 3 feedings starting at 5 a.m. However, the PM pens on that day of terminal sort, we ended up feeding their next day's feed call that evening. So rather than thinking of pushing them behind on feed, we actually moved them forward.
Once again, that was part of the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.